You are now tuned into
Facebook Live
Internet Radio. Radio, we got it on live. Catch up, new era disseminators of information. Comfortable truth, this your motherfucking station.
Facebook Live
Internet Radio.
I want to dedicate this to those who never made it. From kindergarten to the 12th, I never graduated. But college wasn't for some of us, so we joined the service. I seen a kid get murdered and now I'm listening to Elvis. But on the out looking in, things stay the same. But at the same vein, looking out, the whole world changed. So keep your head up, don't get caught up in the fast bucks and find your mom crying while you lying in the black tux.
We don't
Trust
need
me.
no education.
Professor is the head of this particular department, or they have illustrious names in the department, chances are you will never see them teach you in a class. The graduate students on some kind of assistantship will more likely be your teacher. Where are the brains and where are the professors? They're doing research. And often they're doing research on government grants for the government, for the corporations, for the other institutions in the society, and they are part of then the total system of domination of this country. Afrocentric education above all, and even beyond the teaching of African history and African culture, is preparing our children to defend the very lives of African people, is a military preparation and a preparation for war. It is the means by which we will maintain our biological survival as a people. For if you do not survive, what does it matter if you teach reading to 100% of our children, or they learn math well, or they learn computer science, or all the other things you think are important, when your very lives are in the balance, and it is very likely that they will be snuffed out in the next 10 to 20 years. And yet we still continue to look at schools and colleges and universities as vocational institutions. And here we have then at the University of Maryland, long connected with the U.S. Army, by the way, hosting a conference on so-called genetic factors in crime. Reagan charged that this meeting, which was canceled, was part of a broader program, a violence initiative, a federal government research agenda, so that this program was only a part of a larger agenda. And it was designed to move toward finding a genetic marker that would supposedly identify children at high risk of becoming criminals, and to develop plans to deter them through medication. And this is interesting due to the fact that there's little or no real information that links directly in any kind of strong way or even in a mild way a relationship between genes and criminality. There's been no DNA segment that has been discovered that codes for crime. When you think about it, the idea is ludicrous anyway. What is crime? What is violence? What is violence? In other words, I'm asking this question because you have to do a linguistic analysis. They are all forms of what? Violence. There are many different types of what? Crime. Different types of aggression. Not all violence is necessarily bad. There's what we in psychology may call hostile aggression. But there is aggression or violence that may be used in terms of what? Self-defense. Violence may be used to protect your children from attack. Violence may be used to protect the lives of other people. So now if we're going to get a gene for violence, for a type of violence, or in removing the gene for violence, if we were to find it, which is an unlikely situation, are we also removing a people's capacity to defend themselves and to use violence in their own interest? What I'm saying is then, be very careful when people use words like violence, aggression, crime, and so forth, and ask yourself, what kind of crime? You know, do we have a gene for every type of crime you can name, so that even when we change definitions of crime, a new gene comes into being that we're going to find related to that particular crime? And when we decide that certain other behavior is no longer a crime, will the gene which was coded for that crime disappear? Ludicrous. Ludicrous. I talk in Black on Black Violence about the structuration of crime. That crime follows, the type of violence that we talk about, or crime, even its nature, follows the class structure and follows the skills levels of criminals. You see? Why is there so much so-called violent crime in certain segments of the society? Because when you look at the skills levels of the people committing them, if they were to commit a crime, that's not the only crime they could commit. If they were accountants, they would commit the crime of embezzlement and steal hundreds of thousands or millions because they have a particular ability or skill. And you'd be a fool if you were an accountant or in an S&L where you could steal millions of dollars and then make the public pay billions back and then hang out on the street and knock somebody out in the head. So here we have this crimogenic society that robs our people of skills and other means, so that if they decide to participate in a crime, then the probability is that it will be violent by the very nature of the way the society has set them up in the beginning. In other words, the society even determines the type of crime you are most likely to commit itself. Okay? And then it tells you, you're violent. Teach me to be an accountant. I won't hit any more people in the head. I'll just rob them by books. Okay? And then they want to talk about white-collar crime and, you know, and the other kind of collar crime. Come on. Wake up. This has nothing to do with genes. It has to do with the nature. I've also told you about reversal, right? I mentioned the fact that in order for us as a people to be in the situation that we're in, we literally have to be turned backwards. We have to think backwards, behave backwardly, deal with the world backwardly. It's necessary. This is the only way the system can maintain itself. Sometimes I say the best way to win an argument is to concede to your opponent. Okay, there is a genetic marker for crime. Let's now look at the criminal record of African peoples and European peoples. The record is clear. If there is a genetic marker for crime, when we look at the fact that the European has committed a crime against every people on every continent, destroyed millions of people, then that argues for his genetic criminality. And that argues then for us to medicate him and control him. know, the other thing I'm surprised at is we keep being surprised. We keep thinking that this is some new initiative. I mean, the violence initiative began with our enslavement and continues today. We already have fought the violence initiative, ladies and gentlemen. It is already operating. We bought it when we bought learning disabilities, when we bought the concept of hyperactivity, when we bought the concept of impulsivity, when we bought the concept of special education. You're already in it. Connected to these so-called symptoms of learning disability are the very same symptoms they're going to try to connect to the so-called genetic markers. And our children are already being drugged. The violence initiative has already occurred because our youth are already going to jail in record numbers. So why are we talking about these people are initiating something to bring and put our youth in jail? They're already in jail. Those that are not already in jail are in juvenile detention, are under the aegis of the PCWs. You heard it tonight. In the special education program, already being drugged, already being therapized, already having their minds distorted in various ways. And the worst violence initiative program is the public educational system itself. So this so-called initiative that you're talking about tonight is a mopping up operation. That's all it is. If you're telling me in Washington, D.C. and other places, black youth and black people, 75% are in some form of contact with the criminal justice system already, some 60% in any given day in Baltimore and other areas already in contact with the criminal justice system, well then what will this new initiative do? Just make it what? 100%. We should have already been what? Upset. Why are we kicking and screaming now? We should have been screaming already. This initiative is an old trick in psychiatry and psychology. It's a trick that we call the medicalization of social problems. That is to define a social and political problem as a medical problem, and to put psychiatrists who are doctors, physicians with MDs in control of the definition of these problems, even though they are an arm of the state, as are social workers, as are psychologists, as are all of the other helping professionals, but members of the state and arms of the state. But we are so willing to submit to their authority such that when they define social and political behavior and behavior which has social and political causes in medical terms, even the oppressed and the victimized consent to their mistreatment. Louis Sullivan is a part of this, but in a sense we are all a part of it, because we buy the medicalization of issues. And they know, since we are willing to do anything the doctor tells us to do, why are you taking that poison? The doctor said take it every 2 hours. The doctor says. So now if the doctor says that your children have a marker, a genetic marker, then let's go with it. And we don't have time this evening, one of these days we'll talk about psychiatric power and the role of psychiatrists in the system. Oh, the history of psychiatrists is horrendous. You won't believe it. You won't believe the tortures that have been created in the name of psychiatry, that are even being perpetrated today. You won't believe the robbing of civil liberties the robbing of freedom, and all other kinds of things, the complete destruction and taking away of people's constitutional rights in the name of psychiatry. When you medicalize a problem and define it in medical terms, the patient loses all rights. And therefore you can resolve a lot of issues that if they were defined politically or socially would then become constitutional and legal issues. But as soon as they are put under the aegis of medicine, then you reduce to a very great extent the legal and constitutional implications. So what we have going here then is an attempt to move social and political problems into the area of psychiatry so that we, even as African people, can consent to social control and the killing of our people. One quick thing, and I know we're short here. Don't get caught up in this brain and biological basis of behavior. Okay? Don't be deceived because someone can say that they have found a biological correlate with behavior. That means it is genetic in nature, or that means it's congenital, or that means that the society has no responsibility for the behavior that the person is committing. Don't buy that baloney, and people run that a lot. You know, as soon as we can locate some kind of brain deficiency and correlate it, then we're ready to say, oh, society is not responsible for it. Are you kidding? Learning and experience physically transforms the brain. Traumatic experiences and even positive experiences changes the biochemical nature of the brain as well as the neuronal functional organization of the brain and influences the number of dendrites and synapses and other things that cells use to communicate one with the other. Now, you must understand here then, and I could talk a great deal here about the experiments here that have shown very clearly that if you put certain animals through certain experiences, their brains actually can increase in weight. Let me give you a quick run of things that happens when some rats were placed in various environments. One group was placed in a so-called enriched environment. These rats being selected from the same genetic background, having the same genetic background and the same genetic inheritance. But they were put in under different environments. After they were put through, after they lived in these environments for a while, they were sacrificed and their brains looked at, weighed, measured, and analyzed. Now those rats that were put in an enriched environment, let's look at some of the things that were found. They had an increased thickness of the cerebral cortex, or the gray matter. In other words, the thinking matter of their brain increased in thickness and weight. A 15% increase in the actual size of the neurons in the cortex. Increases in protein in the brain paralleling the increases in cortical weight, indicating that the growth effect was on tissue and not just on the fluid content of the brain. An increase in the amount of dendritic branching. Dendrites are the hairy branching fibers which project in large numbers from the body of each neuron and which receive input from other neurons and conduct them to the cell bodies of other neurons. There was an increase in the branching of these neurons, and a greater amount of potential information was available to each neuron. An increased number of dendritic spikes per unit length of dendrite. Increases in the number of synapses and the sizes of the contacts between the synapses. An increase in the ratio between the weight of the cortex and the weight of the rest of the brain. A 15% increase in the number of glial cells, and on we go. What are we saying here then? That experience changes the brain, changes the nature and the functionality of the brain. So simply because you may find a brain correlate does not take society off the hook. It means then that if society controls the experience of a people, controls their experiences, it is manipulating their brain and controlling its size. And so they want to run a game on you with this biological substrate number. A quick reference here to some tentative research that was noted in the New York Times Wednesday, September 16th. And you should read this piece, and the research is tentative, but read the scientific journals. But there's something interesting here. The headline reads, "Behavior therapy can change how the brain functions." Researchers say, like drug therapy, behavior modification therapy produces metabolic, what do we mean there? Chemical enzymatic changes in the brain and functional changes. That is how different parts and areas of the brain relate one to the other in controlling a behavior and initiating a behavior. You know what I'm saying? Like drug therapy, behavior modification. This is a non-drug therapy, right? This is a therapy based on social relationships between the therapist and the client. Okay, and that's what we are comparing here. And what does it say here then? Both of these produces metabolic and functional changes in the brains of people with obsessive compulsive disorder. It is the first time that behavior therapy, remember we're talking about a basic social thing here, even though there's some other adjuncts to it, a method that changes the way people think, and I'm emphasizing think, about uncomfortable thoughts or feelings, the way they deal with uncomfortable thoughts and feelings. This therapy particularly relating to obsessive compulsive behavior where people are exhibiting certain attitudes toward compelling thoughts and behaviors. So this therapy, which seeks to change the way they think about these compulsive feelings and think about these thoughts and these urgings that keep telling them to do things, has been shown to physically alter brain function in a mental disorder. And we could go on, the piece is longer. I brought this up to get those who might think that we only talked about rats. What are we saying here then? That the very nature of human relations itself can change the functional nature of the brain. The idea being then that even when they come to you and tell you that there's some kind of correlation between a brain functionality and a particular behavior, don't fall for the okie-doke that necessarily means that the society is not responsible for producing that behavior. Society shapes the brain as it shapes other things as well. I'll move on quickly here. The theme of black-on-black violence, the book, is that the alleged criminality of black males will be used to justify the repression of the African American community and quite possibly its genocidal annihilation. In other words, the running theme of the book, Black-on-Black Violence, is this: that the alleged criminality of African males will be used as a major rationale so that when this society decides that it will annihilate this community, the other members and nations and people in the world will buy it because they have been convinced that we are innately criminal. And what I'm trying to get across in there then is how this propaganda is developed. This is why, despite what you say from a logical point of view, despite the fact you may say this is not the majority of our youth who are in jail, the vast majority of our youth are not engaged in violent behavior. The majority of people on welfare are not black people. The majority of people in prisons are not black folk. You know, you can lay one fact after another. And yet what happens? The people still insist in seeing it as a black problem, don't they? When you lay evidence and facts before a people, even evidence and fact that they themselves have collected, and they still insist in seeing you in a particular way, then you must recognize that they are seeing you in that way because it is important to their own psychological state of being and because it serves their own interests. Yes. And you must ask the question then, why are they obsessed about projecting this kind of image? And you will see then that it is there to rationalize their behavior against you. They're not, and therefore, as I will say a little later on, this idea of arguing with these people point for point is not what the game is about. It's not what it's about. Let me quickly move on. I want to lay a context, because often we discuss these issues out of context. And I've told you before, as I've told you in Black on Black Violence, that European sociology, psychology, and so forth decontextualizes issues, meaning that it discusses violence or crime as if they do not exist within a social context, as if they do not have a history, as if they do not serve a function in the society. So you're made to look directly at the behavior and the behavior only, and to judge it and treat it without looking at the context in which it occurs, and look at how the context itself may create the behavior. And even behavior therapy plays this game, by the way. Okay? You must start at the context first before you discuss these problems. What is the context? The context is this, that we are a dominated people. We are dominated by European people. Am I making myself clear? This is where we start. This is where you start. We are under the control of another people. We are vulnerable to that other people who are holding our lives and the quality of our lives in their hands. That's the fact you must start with. The second fact is, domination is a social problem. Am I clear here? Domination itself is a problem. It is a social problem, particularly for the dominated, isn't it? Even if it's for the dominator, it's still a social problem. Keep this in mind. Domination, therefore, generates the very existence of domination means that a social problem has been what? Generated. Huh? You can't have domination without having a what? Social problem. So domination generates a social problem, and as long as it exists, it maintains that social problem. As long as you're under the domination of Europeans, you will have social problems. There are some idiots among us who think that they can leave the European in control of African people and get justice and peace. It is not possible. Domination is built on injustice. And you cannot then leave the European in power over black people and then expect to receive justice. It's illogical. It's not possible. Domination benefits the dominator. We are dominated because it what? Benefits those who dominate us. Therefore, the dominator benefits from the social what? Problems. In other words, the problems of black people benefit white folk. And they are created for their benefit, and they are maintained for their benefit. And therefore, those who dominate us have an investment, monetarily and every other way, in perpetuating the symptoms of maladjustment in us as a people, and they engage in interactions that reinforce those problems. That's why no matter what kind of program they lay out for you, it does not resolve the social problems that they claim they're designed to resolve. And I'll be through in just a second or two here. The problems of the dominated provide evidence which justifies their domination and supports their own domination. Ladies and gentlemen, one of the major outcomes of power and one of the major benefits of being powerful is that you can generate the evidence to justify your power and to justify your domination. Why, when I go to prison, I see that 56% of you are in this prison. Therefore, we are justified in controlling you. But then we forget how they created the problem so that 56% could be in there. Now then, as the gentleman who wrote Blaming the Victim put forth, and I will say, first of all, this problem is created. Our problems are needed. This is what I'm arguing in Black on Black Violence, that this society needs the criminality of black males. It needs the fantasy that black males are criminals. It is necessary to the very structure and being of this society. It is very necessary to the self-definition of Europeans. It is very necessary to maintaining their domination and advancing their domination. Therefore, they must create these problems, or they must even imagine that these problems exist where they truly do not exist. Therefore, they create the problem, and then, as Ryan argues, first they identify the social problem, second they study those affected by the problem, and discover in what ways they are different from the rest of us, this great underclass. How are they different from the rest of us? And you know now, arguing Black on Black, that the so-called criminals in the jails are not any different from any of the rest of us. You are not going to find a criminal personality, you know, and yet that's been the golden grail of psychology. You know, how can we distinguish these people from the rest of us? We're all in this game together. Third, they define the differences as the causes of the social problem. In other words, we create the problem. Then we go in and look at the people who have the problem and see how they're different from those who don't. And then we say, oh, their differences is the reason why they have the problem. You see? So they're going to create these brain dysfunctions. Then go in and find the brain dysfunction. And then say the brain dysfunction is the cause of the problem. Now let's medicate. So they define, they use the differences, and finally they assign a government bureaucrat to invent a humanitarian action program to correct the differences. I asked my class the other night, what if we could find a 100% sure shot rehabilitation program? A program that would rehabilitate 100% of the clients. Would that solve your problem? No, because what would happen? The others would keep what? Rolling in. Rolling in. So rehabilitating the ones who have the problem does not solve what? The original what? Cause of the problem. And again, we have people who enter into the wrong part of the equation. Let me get here then and say, these controversies such as the one we are dealing with now, they speak to the need for domination to justify and maintain itself. Howard Zinn stated, the establishment, whatever rewards it gives us, will also, if necessary, to maintain its control, kill us. Hear that, black bourgeoisie. A part of your being promoted in American society is to maintain control of the black community. The day that your death is necessary also to maintain control and to maintain white power, they will kill you as well. And I want you to keep this in mind then. I don't want you to fall into the trap of discussing this particular issue. We fall into a trap by concentrating on the scientific and methodological details. You know, well, there's no genes. When you find it, forget all that nonsense. And get caught up in personalities. Well, Goodwin is an evil guy. You know, Louis Sullivan is a... Screw all of that. It's the same kind of thing you have with Columbus. If Columbus had not discovered America, some other European would have. Even if you could step back into history and kill Columbus, you'd still be in the same shape you are right now. Because what is the essential problem here? Columbus didn't build the ships. Columbus didn't build the technology. It was European technology, political and economic organization that made it possible for Columbus to come over here. And it was European technology, organization, intentionality that made it possible for them to overrun the Indian nations. What you have here then were two different cultures and two different technologies and two different ways of thinking facing each other, and one ran over the other. Not Columbus. I want you to get out of the personality issue and deal with the deep issue. You are facing a society and a culture. You are facing an organization that will put man after man after man in front of you, but it will still run the same program. You must learn to cripple the organization, not the person. This is an old argument. It's the same kind of old game that went on with the genetic basis of intelligence. It's the same old game refried. What do we have here? Let's look at the deeper issue. And the deeper issue involves the need to justify domination, social control, and to obscure the very real way deficiencies are created by power relations. Quick question here. Why are whites obsessively concerned with the intelligence of black folks? This is the thing you must ask first before you get into whether it's environment or genes. Ask the major question. Why are you interested? What's the point? Huh? Why is it so what? Important for you to know. What are you going to do with the knowledge? This is the issue. What would be the result if it was definitely and irrefutably established that blacks are innately less intelligent than whites? Let's ask that question. Let's ask another one. Or we found irrefutably that we were more intelligent than whites. What would be the results? Or just as intelligent as whites, or that environment is really significantly influential in determining intelligence. What would be the result if we discovered either one of these things? What would be the result if we proved that blacks were genetically more docile than white folk? The end result would what? Be the same. Would be the same. Nothing is going to change. Why? The findings, whatever their nature, will be used to justify and rationalize the social control of black people by white people. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, if they proved that we were innately less intelligent than they would justify domination, wouldn't it? We are more intelligent, therefore we have a right to rule over you. But then if you prove to them in your great work that you are more intelligent than they are, well, these people are more intelligent than we are. We should suppress them while we can, because if we let them loose, they will take over. So the repression would still take place, and it would still be argued. Well, they are as intelligent as we are, and that means one day they may compete with us, so let's still what? Repress them. Oh, you mean the environment is truly significant in intelligence. So what would the result be then? Let us control what? The environment to control their intelligence. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, the final come down of it all, no matter how you refute these people, no matter how much detail you roll out one way or the other, they will always be used to do what? Justify repression and oppression. That is the issue not making fine-pointed arguments as to whether IQ tests are culturally based or genetically based or this so-called initiative here. It's pointless. What we have going here is an attempt by people who are dominating us to create new rules and means by which they justify their domination and repression. That's all that's going on here. Screw whatever excuse they rolled up in time. The only thing that has changed by any so-called new initiative, such as the one we're talking about today, is the logic of justification for continuing domination and the methodology of domination. That's the only thing that's changed. Nothing has changed by this new initiative. All they said, well, their violence is a medical problem, and therefore now the methodology for that is to do what? Cut their brains out and medicate them and so forth. But the end result is still what? Domination and control. Thus the central issue revolves around power and domination and maintaining the relative powerlessness of black people and finding rationales for doing so. For a very sizable percentage of black problems flow from the nature of black and white power relations. These problems that we are dealing with flow from our powerlessness, from the power differential between blacks and white folk. They reflect the differences in power between us as people. Nothing else. No brain issues here. The issue then for the black community is this: how to break white power and the will of whites and any other ethnic group to dominate and exploit African people. And I'm telling you, any other ethnic group, because whites are not the only ones who are moving in place to dominate African people. And the issue then is this, and you must keep this in mind, this must be our agenda. This is our agenda, to break the power of people to control our lives. This is the agenda. An agenda set by us, not by others. Our program for change and empowerment, for enhancing the education of our children, for maximizing our quality of life, should continue regardless of academic and social debates regarding the social or genetic bases of criminality, intelligence, and so forth. What am I saying? We must keep focused on changing the nature of power in this world, regardless of the debates about what is going on. If you get caught up in the details, you're going to lose the focus. One other thing, and I'm through. We got some people out here looking for conspiracies. I want to note this because I see a lot of this going on, and there are people on the circus getting over on the conspiracy number. And there are others, you know. Let me just warn you about one thing, black people. You must think in terms of a nation. You must think of yourself as a nation. It's very important that you think of yourself as a nation. Many of the issues that you see confronting you can become very clear if you think of yourself as a nation surrounded by other nations. I tell people I haven't written the second book on the cause of violence, the economic cause of violence, but there is an economic cause. I talked about the psychodynamics in Black on Black, but there's another part of the story, which is the economics. Quickly, it's like this, ladies and gentlemen. If you saw black people in the United States as a nation, you would recognize that to a very great extent, the social disorganization that we complain about, the breakdown of families and institutions, the criminality of our children and so forth, is the result of the fact that as a nation, black people are suffering from a negative trade imbalance, In other words, black people have an overwhelming national debt. What do we mean by that? It means that more of your money, earnings, income are flowing out than what? Are flowing in. You jumped for equal opportunity and you educated your most talented people and you sent them away from you and sent them to work for other people. And the monies they earned, you told them to live among those other people, so they contribute their brains and skills to your enemies and spend their monies among your enemies and enhance their power. And now they become neoconservative and join the attack on the African community. You understand what I'm saying? Anytime a nation buys more than it sells, anytime that a nation ships its wealth out in great bundles, anytime a nation lets other alien groups, Arabs, Koreans, and others, and whites, come into its midst and take its money out, and then let the drug dealers scrape up the rest and take that money out, their institutions are going to collapse on their heads. Your families are breaking up because they do not have the economic floor that they need to keep them there. Your children are going wild because you don't have the money to give them the appropriate education and recreation and other kind of things you need. You cannot build the institutions that you need to maintain the viability of your society because you're giving it to everyone else. And you're shipping it out. And therefore you suffer from it. Now, with this view in mind, what does this mean? You can solve this problem to a very great extent if you think of yourself as a nation, remove the aliens from your midst, and thrust out into the world and earn wealth and money and bring it back to your nation and watch its prosperity increase and watch the people become more civil with one another, build the kind of institutions to create the kind of schools you want. But until you do that, it's not going to happen. This is the program. Conspiracy, then. There are people out here looking for the mad scientists who made the AIDS gene. And now they're looking at Goodwin. He's the mad man that's getting ready to run the nut sort of thing. And there are others who are in the government huddling around. Screw all that. Stop wasting your time hunting for the smoking gun. When you are a nation, you recognize one thing. When you discover the conspiracy, it's too late. Yeah, it's too late. When you discover it, it's too late. If you are a nation, you know what you act on as a nation? You act on capability of your enemy. They can be your friends, as a matter of fact. They can have good relationships with you. But the moment they develop the capacity to destroy you, you don't worry about whether they hate you or love you or they're conspiring against you. You recognize that they have the capacity to destroy you should they what? Want to. You don't search for the conspirators. You search for a way to defend yourself against one what? Should it occur. It's the fact that whites have the capacity to use AIDS that should move us to build a defense. That they have the capacity to destroy African nations that should move us to build a military. That they have the capacity to destroy our people in economic warfare. Not whether they are thinking of doing so or whether there's some person who's doing so. Screw that. Don't put the energy in what? Building a defense and an offense on the fact that they are capable of doing so. All right? It's necessary. So, ladies and gentlemen, our eyes, we should do what? Keep the agenda on changing the power relationship, empowering ourselves so that we can defend ourselves regardless of the type of conspiracies any groups have against us. So what does it mean, ladies and gentlemen? Keeping our eyes on the prize. And that prize is power. Power to the people. Thank you very much. We need more linear thinking at this point. Oh, yes. Does that mean that we forget the intuition? Not at all. Does that mean we forget the oral tradition? Not at all. But it means then that while maintaining those traditions, we also must enhance other aspects of our personality. We want to look a bit at culture. What is culture? And we should ask this again. I admire Chancellor Williams very much, and I think the destruction of black civilization, of course, was a magnificent book, and I've said many times, though I think many people read it incorrectly. They read it as history, which it really is not per se. It is, as he stated very clearly, a set of case studies, an analysis of African culture and of African history with the question in mind, in what way did these cultures or this history advance our interests as a people, and in what way did this history fail us as a people as well? And we have to look at it that way. What were the problems represented by African cultures such that we permitted ourselves to be overrun by Europeans, and we find ourselves in the situation that we find ourselves tonight? Understand? It's no insult for us to ask that question of ourselves. And it's no insult for us to look critically at African history and culture and to be critical of it. It is only through our being critical of our history and our culture.
Peace. Who's on the line?
Our interests as a people.
And how you doing, family?
As a people.
Let me pause this. Who's this?
Roger.
What's going on, Roger?
Hey, not too much.
Oh yeah,
we tearing up things, looking good.
Oh yeah, we just sitting back listening to the ancestor, you know, taking it back, you know. He lit a fire up under my ass today, listening to him, and I'm like, hey, I gotta put him on and let people listen to him, see what perspectives he was coming with back then. You dig?
Oh yeah.
So I'm gonna let it roll, and then afterwards, you know, we could talk about it a bit. You dig?
Yes, sir.
All right, here we go.
Thanks.
Looking at the question, what is culture? Horton and Hunt said from their life experiences, a group develops a set of rules and procedures for meeting their needs. The set of rules and procedures, together with a supporting set of ideas and values, is called a culture. To a great extent, you see, a culture involves a set of rules and a procedure for meeting needs. And this is the thing we have to keep in mind. You don't have a culture just to have a culture. And you don't claim a culture just because it's a culture or just because it's African. The ultimate thing that culture must do is solve problems. That's why people evolve a culture. That's why culture comes into existence as a way of what? Solving problems and meeting needs. That's why, at a certain point, when a culture no longer meets the needs of a people or solves the problem confronting a people, that culture must be transformed. There's nothing sacred about holding a culture in the face of, you know, new events and new changes. Unless, of course, you're free to do that if you're willing also to accept suicide or death. And you have that right to that choice. You know, I tell people, you know, we have the right to say, look, we're going to hold on to this culture even if it kills us. But we should be what? Very conscious of our decision. We should not be holding on to it out of a misunderstanding of what culture is supposed to do. Ultimately, culture is supposed to solve problems and to meet the needs of the people. And a culture then has to be measured against those standards. Does this culture meet our needs? Does it solve our problems? Chancellor Williams, in a sense, then looked at the African cultures, looked at African characteristics, and looked at them in terms of in what way did they meet our needs, and in what way did they deal with the slave trade and colonialism and the other kind of things that happened to us as African people. And after going through that, Then he set up what? The plan, which a lot of people don't read. Which is the whole point of what? This is the whole point of the book. Not the first part, but really the second part. Looking at our culture and our history critically, and looking at our situation and where we are today as a result of that history and of those cultures, he then draws out a map for a plan, a way for us to what? Get out of our situation and to restore African civilization and to restore African people. But it's at that point most people sort of move on to something else. This is the place you must study. We're going to include that in our Power of Studies, by the way. That plan along with some others. The sets and rules and procedures together with a supporting set of ideas. Cultures are not just ways people sing and dance and what they eat and how they dress and the rituals and so forth that they perform. These ways of behaving and dressing and so forth are based on sets of ideas and values. And ultimately, in a deeper sense, it's this set of ideals and values that lay the basis for culture. Cluckern and anthropologists indicated that culture is all the, and he defined culture as all the historically created designs for living, explicit and implicit, rational, irrational, and non-rational, which may exist at any given time as potential guides for the behavior of man, for the behavior of the people. In other words, culture creates designs as a result of its history for living and provides guides for its members, guides for behaving. As a set of the guides for designing, for guiding the behavior of its members, a culture provides standards of proper cognitive, emotional, and behavioral conduct. Culture provides a set of norms and concepts of what is to be expected to exist, why we expect them to exist. Though culture is a product of actual experience, culture is essentially ideological, meaning that it essentially exists in the mind, because culture ultimately is based on the sharing of beliefs and customs and expectations. We receive our culture as a result of, as a part of our social heritage. To the degree that the individual identifies or is at one with this culture, and to the degree to which the members of a culture identify with it, culture is represented in the minds of its people. In other words, we have to recognize deeply that culture cannot exist outside of ourselves. It only can exist in our minds and in our bodies as a people. And therefore, to a great extent, it is ideological more than it is physical, more than it is behavioral, more than it is just ways of dressing. Ultimately, a culture must be represented in the very minds of a people. And it is only through its representation as a mental entity that a people can identify with a culture. A culture is a way of thinking, a way of attending the world, of perceiving the world, of classifying and categorizing the world, of ordering the world, of processing information, and of evaluating the world. When we say then that the Europeans decultured us or distorted our culture, we are also saying then that the Europeans have distorted our modes of attending the world, our modes of experiencing the world, our modes of classifying and categorizing the world, our modes of processing information that comes from the world. So there's no little wonder then that we are having problems in what some people call education, particularly as it is Eurocentrically designed, that our children are perceived as having problems in thinking skills and math skills and science skills and so forth. Because ultimately, you see, culture provides you with a frame for thinking. It provides you with a structure for organizing information, for classifying information, for evaluating information, you see, for processing information. And when you distort a people's culture, then you distort their capacity to appropriately organize information and deal with it. And this is what has happened to us. This is the reason why I say again and again that the problem of education, in terms of the problems our children have in schools, are not education problems. They are political. They only express themselves as educational problems. The problems our children may have in paying attention, thinking so-called logically, categorizing, classifying, in terms of vocabulary and so forth, are really not academic problems. They are cultural problems, and they are the result of political interactions. Because in transforming our sense of who we are and what we are, and in transforming our culture, so was our thinking and so forth transformed as well. This is why ultimately the educational problems of our people will have to be solved in terms of cultural transformation, not just in terms of educational technique, you see. And this is what the whites try to lay on us. You know, we're going to discover finally that great reading technique. Children can learn almost in any way you teach them. But it's about more than technique. It must be a part of a total cultural structure. And the children must come with a cultural intentionality, because no technique is going to matter if they pay no mind, if they have no interest. You see, if their culture has given them little or no reason for learning what is to be taught, if what they're learning is really not relevant to their situation and their circumstances. And so we have to understand very much how culture itself structures the thought processes. Now, there are some of you who are saying, but there are those of us who knew nothing about African culture and we got all A's in school and so forth and so on. Remember this, though. We got these A's in school and we went through these schools at the price of alienation. As the gentleman who's Carter G. Woodson wrote about the fact that it took him, 30 years to get over that Eurocentric education? What is he talking about? To a degree, without that African-centeredness, without that African sense of culture, without an African-centered intentionality that determined why he was learning and for what reason he was learning and how he was going to use his learning in the interest of African people, he adopted an alien culture, as many educated blacks have had to do. In adopting the alien culture and adopting the alien outlook and adopting alien values and so forth, they adopted then a thought framework, you see, that allowed so-called success within the European academic system, you see. But the unfortunate thing about it is, once you adopt that structure and that mode and orientation of thinking, you can only work within it. And so you can keep your ability to think abstractly and logically and scientifically only if you work for us as a as a scientist. But you cannot take that thought and outside of that structure and use it in your own interest. And this is the dilemma that many of those who so-called succeeded in this system have had to face. You see, I categorize and I classify, but I categorize and I classify in terms of European structures, and I find that I'm only comfortable in working within those structures, and I can only advance those structures. The European system has this economic system set up in such a way that when you try to use this structured kind of thought outside of the system, it won't pay you. Yeah, it will punish you. And often your own group has problems with it. because our group only pays preachers. But it would rarely pay anyone else that tries to operate in its interest. And so you get caught up in two worlds. Socially, culture patterns the ways in which its members relate to each other, interact with each other, perceive each other, and the ways they organize, develop, institutionalize, and apply their human potential in order to adapt to the conditions in which they live to satisfy psychological and social survival needs. Ultimately, as I said again and again, culture is about solving problems. But we're going to learn, as I've indicated before, solving problems in a cultural way, creating power in a cultural way, requires relating to each other in a particular sort of way. Implies interacting with each other in a particular sort of way and perceiving each other in a particular sort of way. I've indicated under other circumstances that individuals do not have power. Power is the result of the nature of social relations between people. The way people choose to interact with each other makes power. If you don't believe it, you could go back a few years and see how little white boys could order grown black men around. Were they big enough to beat them? Were they big enough, did they have enough power to knock them down? No, they didn't. But it was because those little white kids were in a, structured framework and had behind them, a set of structures and strategies that because white people had chosen to relate to each other in a particular way and interact with each other in a particular way and interact with us in a particular way, even a white child could come out and express power over black folk. But the power was not inherent in the child, but it was inherent in the culture and inherent in how that culture was designed and structured. And it's out of this, and this is what I've told you before about an economic system. An economic system is not the mere existence of money. Economic systems existed prior to money. Money as an instrument of economy has come late in the history of man. And yet we've had economies for hundreds and thousands of years before money came into existence. So ultimately then, an economy must have something to do with the way people choose to cooperate with each other and relate to each other. It is out of this that an economy develops, and it's out of this that power develops. You see, so if you have a culture, the culture is going to provide patterns of relating and interacting. It's these patterns of relating and interacting that permits a people who belong to a culture to solve the problems that confront them. So you see, again, it's just not something, as the sister indicates, that you wear, you see, or the speech that you make. You see, it ultimately has to be about relating in a particular structured sort of way. This is what culture is socially. It is very important to keep in mind that a culture is, to a significant extent, a historical product. Let's talk a second about identity. Identity is the social and personal outcome of or product of an identification process. According to Bandura, this identification process is a process in which new responses are acquired and existing repertoires of behaviors are modified to some extent as a result of subjection to direct or indirect conditioning procedures. All cultures condition the people that belong to them. All cultures ultimately must have some means of rewarding and punishing behavior. And that's another thing we don't want to face, you know. We want everybody to do right just because it means doing right. And this is what I said earlier when we talk about these conspiracies and the boule. You're not going to win this game if you don't have a means of neutralizing people and rewarding people, you see, and controlling people. The reason why, as I've often said, the very first thing that we must do if we are to transform our children is to get control of them. Yeah. Yes. And we must become their primary rewarders and punishers. We must determine the conditions under which they are socialized if we want to create the kinds of people we need to solve our problems. You are not going to solve your problems giving the control of your children over to other people. And yet we sit around here hoping every day, after pushing our children and ourselves into the faces of white folk, into the faces of our enemies, that these people by luck or some means will happen to be the kind of people we need for ourselves. The very point and process of education is to create the people you need for your benefit. And if a culture is going to educate your children, it then will educate them to benefit whom? Itself, not you. Not you. You must bring your children under your own control, and you must be in control of the conditioning process. This is what it's about. If you don't have control of that, then really you're not going to have control of the children. Because identification with a culture, becoming cultured or enculturated, is the result of a culture approving and disapproving, of rewarding and not rewarding, and of sometimes even punishing, to ultimately shape the individual in a way that it benefits the culture, and ultimately the individual, him or herself. And this is what identity is about. It's about the patterning of thoughts, feelings, and actions after other persons who serve as models. You even learn to love. You know, we think that love is something natural, just flows out of us automatically. And yet we have a number of cultures who did not base marriage and these other things, as I've told you before, on romantic love. Even romantic love is taught and learned. Yeah. People are taught how to feel. And we do it all the time. You shouldn't feel that way. You should feel ashamed of yourself for thinking this way, for behaving this way. And we're so unconscious, we don't even recognize it, you see. But we are doing what? We are dictating what? Feelings, thoughts, emotions. What is love? The kids hear it all day long in their records, right? The chill run up my spine. I can't get him out of my mind. I can't eat. I can't sleep. I can't... What is all this is what? Defining what? This is the way you feel if you're in what? If you're in love. You see? And when you got that feeling, then you can do some other things. And you can, make all kind of commitments based on that. But many cultures have built marriage and family and other things on different modes of thinking and behavior other than that. And when you study the history of romantic love, when this type of love approach and this type of approach for building families and so forth first started coming up, there were many people who thought it was just a sign of madness, of sickness, of a precarious basis upon which to build family and culture, you see. But what we're trying to illustrate here is that culture, to a good extent, through its conditioning processes and other processes, through providing models, helps people to pattern their ways of thinking and feeling and behaving, and pattern attitudes. Both the conditioning procedures and contingencies and the models are provided by culture. And of course we recognize that this is one of our major problems today, that often the models that we want to exhibit before ourselves and our children, and often the means by which we can reward our children's behavior, have not been placed in our hands. That another culture has control of the conditioning mechanism and has control of the models that by which our children are socialized. We must recognize again then, if we are serious about enculturating our people and enculturating our children, then we must gain the means by which we have to condition their enculturation. We must gain the capacity to reward, to punish, and to reinforce, to model the kind of behavior for our children and ourselves that we need to model. Identity is achieved when, as a result of having undergone the identification process, the individual comes to perceive himself as possessing a distinct and unique character or personality, as being a person in his own right, as being able to answer the questions to his own satisfaction: who am I? What am I? And what do I do with my life? Identity, to the extent that it is a cultural product, and identity is a cultural product. And I want to emphasize this because, you see, in this society, we stress individualism. And I try to get across to people all the time that in reality there's no such thing as an individual. That is a social fiction. It is a type of label we use, but it does not exist in reality. That the individual, the thing that we call an individual, is really a synthesis of social experience. A unique combination of our having interacted with others and having undergone social experiences, and it's our unique way of expressing our social relations and our experiences. But who we are and what we are is the result of social relations. It is not something that is completely what? Unique to us and not shared on some level with others. The very fact that you speak a language means that you have a shared identity on some level. If you were completely individual, no one would be able to understand what you were saying. You see? You cannot fit into what? An ordered system and in an ordered society. If you want to imagine you can be a complete individual if you were in space all by yourself. But then what would be the point? It would have no what? No meaning. It would be pointless. Even the concept of individual can only achieve its definition within a social structure. It only has meaning within a social structure and in terms of relating socially to someone else. Otherwise, it is pointless. It is the social that creates the individual, not the other way around. And yet those who rule over us, you see, would have us think that we can be individuals in and of ourselves and by ourselves without any connection whatsoever to anyone else. And in that way, of course, it can maintain the disunity of our culture and maintain our disunity as a people and ultimately destroy us as a people. So identity is a cultural product. It is the incarnation of a cultural ideology, ecology, and of cultural practice. Identity is culture made flesh. Identity is an instrument for the expression of cultural power. Yes. When an individual identifies with a culture, and remember we said culture is ultimately contained what? In us. Then the individual becomes the what? Instrument of that culture. You see? And this is what I tried to tell you some lectures ago when I talked about manhood, right? When I told you that manhood is a social definition, and to be a man is to be socially defined, so that in expressing what it means to be a man, in defending one's manhood, one also does what? Expresses one's culture and defends what? The culture. And in defending the honor of one's manhood, one defends what? The honor of the culture and the honor of the people. And therefore, ultimately, manhood is an expression of the culture, not of a chauvinistic wish on the part of a male. It is not to be defined in isolation and detached from the needs of the culture itself. That when manhood becomes defined, detached from the needs of the culture itself, detached from the needs of people itself. When boys are not trained into men relative to the culture, then these boys will prey upon the culture and destroy the culture. And this is a part of what we have in so-called black-on-black violence. Boys who've been brought into manhood in ways that are detached from African culture and African people, you see, who have not engaged in training in an organic relationship to their Africanness. And therefore, since they are not socially defined, they then become antisocial in their behavior. So ultimately, you see, an identity and a personality is a cultural instrument, and it is through this identity and through this personality that the culture expresses itself, and the culture is perpetuated, and the culture has an impact on the world, and the culture expresses itself as power and defends itself as a culture. But if it defends itself as a culture, it defends its members as people as well. You see? But when people are detached from a culture, they stand alone. And they are undefended. They become vulnerable. And others now destroy them one by one, here and there. And ultimately, a whole of a people are wiped out. Thus, identity, self-concept, are products and instrumentalities as much, if not more, political, economic entities than social, psychological entities. What am I saying here again? We're used to seeing identity as a psychological concept. You see, we talk about my identity as if it belongs to what? Me only. You see, my personality, my this. No. Ultimately, we must recognize that our personalities and our identities are, to a good extent, instrumentalities for our culture. But the thing that we want to recognize more so than this is that identity, self-concept, what we call the self and personality, are as much political and economic entities as they are social and psychological entities. In other words, identity, even in a diffuse state, is a political economy, an organization of interests, tastes, desires, passions, ideals, motives, values, etc., the pursuit of and the satisfaction of which maintains social power relations, social prerogatives, the integrity of the social, political, economic system, the cultural status quo. What am I saying here? The culture, in inculcating particular values in people, in inculcating particular desires in people, and they don't see, the culture doesn't inculcate into you the desire for what? Everything, does it? No, it says what? You should desire this and not that. This is desirable, but this is horrible. You know, this you should be interested in, that you don't have to worry about. You see, this you should feel strongly about, that you shouldn't have to worry about. You see, this you should strive to be, these are the ideals we wish you would actualize. This you don't have to try to strive to be. As a matter of fact, you can reject this. This is where you should try to go. These are the goals that we approve of, the others we don't. Now, so a culture then organizes these values, these ideals, these interests, and so forth. This is a part of our cultural identity, such that when you pursue the satisfaction of these desires, when you pursue the actualization of the cultural ideals, when you pursue the interests that the culture has inculcated in you, what do you do then? By doing this, you maintain what? The culture itself. You see? And many of those things are political, and many are economic. In other words, if a culture tells you that eating a certain food is the right thing to do, and this is what we're about, and eating this food is central and important to our culture, then believe it or not, there's going to be a system of production to do what? Produce what? That food. a system of what? Distribution as well, you see. And a whole system of economic what? Relations, you see. So therefore, this taste, even the taste for food, or certain interests, when you pursue them, maintain a social system and maintain an economic system. And if the structure of that culture, if it's a class culture, a class structure, and if that structure is built on wealth and the accumulation of wealth and the control of the means of production by certain people, your pursuit of those cultural tastes helps to maintain the structure of that culture. Am I getting through? Am I putting you to sleep? Hang in with me, please. Okay. It's very important that we get this in mind. Because without this theory and understanding this, you're going to go blindly into the training of young boys and the training of your young girls. You're going to take them through the rituals and everything, but they're going to still have European taste and desire European things. And they still pursue European ideals and all that, even with their kente on. And despite then, and their superficial behavior, if those tastes and interests and passions and so forth are not also transformed in particular directions, despite their superficial attachment to African culture, they will continue to perpetuate their oppression and maintain the system that they think they're trying to get out from, you see. And this is why you have to understand this theoretical thing, so that you know where you're going when you're talking about educating these children African-centrically, you see. This is why you ultimately are going to have to reject multiculturalism and understand that it's African-centeredness that must be taught to our children, not multiculturalism. Multiculturalism says, all right, everybody's culture's okay, you know, Pollyanna. Oh, you got a culture, I got a culture, all God's children got a culture. So, you know, it's all right. You can taste from this one, you can taste from that one, you buy from this one, you buy from that one, which is exactly what black folk are doing right now. You see? And therefore what? Keeping other people's families alive, keeping them out of crime, keeping them well housed, you know, and all the things we're doing because we have not controlled our what? Taste and interest and evolved them in ways that they advance our culture and us as a people. Please get rid of multiculturalism. And it makes you believe every culture is all right. Here you are suffering from European culture, and now you're going to, you know, it's all right. You can't put one down and put the other one up. I mean, Europeans amuse me anyway, talking about their cultural traditions and what great traditions they have brought to the world. The tradition is what you do. Yeah. And it's an insult as an African man to have Europeans talk about their great tradition. You may talk about your philosophy, but that's not your tradition. You may talk about your religion, but that's not your tradition. Or if it is your tradition, then no matter how beautiful it sounds, I must reject it. Because it enslaved me. It oppressed me. And the whole bit, you see. So, and I don't care how sweet it sounds and how logically it is put together, or how literate it may be. The ultimate thing is, in what way does it express itself in relationship to me and my people? And if this is the outcome of European tradition, then that tradition must be rejected. You must understand, ladies and gentlemen, what Europeans call great tradition goes hand in hand with their capacity to kill. You know, the Germans, I couldn't understand. You know, we were the literary people and we were the, you know, this and that. But that's one of the reasons why you were able to kill the way you did. Because that was also in there as well. You look at Elijah Muhammad, a misunderstood person. Yeah, misunderstood. Because again, sometimes we're so right-brained, we let our dislike or disapproval of certain of his behaviors overshadow our capacity to see what gifts he brought us as a people, and to come to really understand what this man was about and the greatness of what he created in the Nation of Islam. Yeah. Because we let a series of events get to us so much, we want to throw the baby out with the wash water. You see. But what was he doing? He recognized, too, that cultural identity, religious identity, were as political as they were psychological, were as economical as they were psychological, you see. And he recognized then that he had to also change the taste of black people and change their what? Interests as well. Their emotions and their what? Feelings as well. And a part of that change was projection of the white man is demon mythology, which was very functional and real. But very functional. See, I've told you, a lot of people think, oh, well, that wasn't the truth. This wasn't the point. It wasn't the point. It amazes me now. You know, someone mentioned the Tuskegee experiments. These whites are going to tell all the truth now that they got the what? The world what? Wrapped up. But in wrapping it up, they projected the what? The myth. Because the myth, the major function of the myth is to organize people, to organize a people's perception of themselves, to give them a sense of destiny and commonality, to arrange their social relations in such a way so that they could achieve particular points and particular ends. And it's not that they didn't know that the Egyptians might have been African. It was in their literature. That's a lot of where we got it from, isn't it? But at the point where a mythology of Africans as being uncultured served to organize them and create a unity among themselves, and served to create a set of relations that permitted them to make a conquest of the globe, they projected that mythology. And it was a powerful one. Now that they think they have it made, they say, well, yeah, you were Egyptians, weren't you? Oh, yeah, we did give you TB down there. You know, what are you going to do about it? Oh, now we're becoming honest folk. You know, but what happened? No banks are changing hands. No means and ownership of production are changing hands. No real control of your destiny is changing hands. But you're multicultural now. We have greater understanding and truth. It's got to go deeper than that. You got to do more than tell the truth. You're going to reparate yourself. We're going to take these reparations from you. You can admit we're Egyptians if you want to, but it's not the end of it. No way. And we as black people can't fall for the okie doke. Oh, they say we're Egyptian. Ain't that wonderful? Oh, they're saying that we're this and we're that. Isn't that nice? Now, you see, because now we're moving toward multiculturalism, right? Suddenly we're going to see them all as nice and sweet and wonderful. But what? The actual power relations that run the world will do what? Be exactly what? The same. As a matter of fact, we will even support them now because we feel so good about ourselves. Elijah Muhammad then sought to change taste. So when he had you eating that bean pie, you see, it was a different kind of thing. And eating once a day. Wearing a different type of clothes, you see. It was just not an imposition of tyranny. That's what the other people would like to tell you. Even though they were tyrannizing you far worse than Elijah Muhammad was doing, if you want to call it that. But what? If we demonize the Europeans, we wean our people from the pursuit of things what? European. You see? If we then create new tastes, and tastes for which we can produce, you see, now the person in pursuing their taste will produce for their own nation and economically what? Support the nation. In other words, your money follows your interests. Your money follows your tastes. Your money follows your what? Passions. And one of the major powers that this culture has is to create tastes, passions, and interests in African people. And this is what Eurocentric culture is about. The organizing of African tastes, interests, and passions, so that in our pursuit of those interests and passions, in our attempt to satisfy them, we carry the Europeans all of our money, and we impoverish ourselves looking for the better life and the better feeling. Therefore, the Europeans have all the products for which they've created a taste in us. And then other immigrants come in and get the products under their control. And we as African people then support and feed all of them while we starve our own children. And consequently, you see, our children have learned often that the only way they can get money out of our pocketbooks is to knock us in the head and take it. That's right. Because they're not going to get it by what? Investing and spending in a planned sort of way and following tastes that have been created within our own culture and our own so forth and so on. Because we have told them that buying things European and pursuing things European and so forth was what it means to be alive and to be real and to be free and the whole bit. And yet it's the pursuit of those very things that has imprisoned us and will maintain us in prison. This is why I've told you many times before that we will be most enslaved when we feel freest. Yes, we will be most impoverished when we feel wealthy. Because as soon as we get the money, we're going to do what? Take it somewhere else and impoverish ourselves. At the moment we feel free to buy everything we want to, we're going to buy it from whom? Others. And they will use that wealth to maintain our oppression as a people, you see. So this is why we must understand here the relationship between culture and identity. We must understand that culture itself is an instrument of power. Some people criticize Elijah Muhammad for calling Islam black Muslim, or black Islam. But there's a purpose there. It's unorthodox. Islam is not a racist religion. Even though all I see is doggone Arabs hanging up there in North Africa. And I don't see any equal sharing between African Africans and Arab Africans in the heart of Islam. I don't give a hoot what you say about how universal it is. Show it to me in practice. And I don't see it in practice. And you'll learn something very clear. These Europeans and these other groups are going to lay all kind of universal bullshit on your head as a way of maintaining you in slavery. Yes. In fact, the best way to enslave a Negro is to get him universal. Yeah. I'm for all people. That means he can't be for himself. He even feels guilty about being for himself. Yeah, you tell him, look, let's act in terms of who we are. Oh, no, I'm for all people. Which means I can't commit myself to what? To anyone else. But you see, when other people have already got the scheme set up, it does, what you are for all for doesn't work for all people, though. It seems to always go to what? Particular people. Because I've said, you see, we are absolutists. You see, we believe that if we know the truth and hear the truth, that's the only thing we must believe. And I've told you before, in terms of the Christian theology here, that Africans did not come to America as Christians. I don't care how much you shout and kick over benches. You got to understand that. Your African and our African ancestors did not come to America as what? Christians. And it's very important to recognize that. Does that impute Christianity? No, I'm not about attacking Christianity. I'm not about attacking the reality of Christ or your sincerity. This is not what this is about. You must, though, ask the question, who taught you Christianity? And why did they teach it to you? In other words, you must ask what? Functional questions. How does your teaching me this work for you? And how does it work for me? Even though what I believe you're saying is true and absolutely true, my believing it and your believing the same thing brings about what? Two different consequences. So while the principle you're teaching is universal and absolutely true, given the context in which this is operating, in the context of the fact that you have all the money and you have all the power, my believing this is going to what? Help you to do what? Maintain your money and your power and maintain my weakness. So you can't just fall for an idea simply because it's universal and absolutely true. You've got to look at it within the context in which that idea is being projected. And you got to look at it in terms of who is believing it, because the idea will generate effects based on the context in which it operates, not in and of itself. You see? And this is what has happened to black folk who've taken up other religions and had those other people say, you know, you just believe this, and this is true, this is universally true. This has nothing to do with race, and Islam is not a racist religion. That's fine when the Arabs own what? Everything. And that means then that I won't perceive the Arab as a race, right? Even though it was just by coincidence, all of his race owns everything, has everything. Then I'll be made to feel guilty for even thinking in terms of what? My race. Even though my children are going hungry, they're robbing me at night, terrorizing the community and the whole bit, it's wrong for me to think of them as race and think in terms of them as a people and so forth, because I believe in this universal principle. And yet it is the inequality of wealth and the inequality of power and all kinds of inequalities that are what? Creating the problem. But because I am not allowed to see these inequalities in terms of race, you see, even though when we see the victims of them, the race is quite apparent, I cannot transform this situation. You got to be careful with this game, ladies and gentlemen, because this is the kind of game people run on you all the time. You see, whenever people bring you universal truths, whenever they bring you, you know, these great brotherhood ideas, you must ask yourself how believing this is going to function for you. And given your power, and given this or given this, how's it going to function for you and how's it going to function for me? These fighters went over the world talking about the invisible hand in the laissez-faire economy, you know. Or they come up with some stupidity like, we are all God's children, we are all one, we are all human. Nationalism is wrong. We shouldn't discriminate according to border. People should be able to invest wherever they feel like investing, you know. And people should take advantage of opportunities wherever they arise. Now that sounds so nice and neat, doesn't it? And it is. I have no problem with that. Except, though, you got to move beyond that. You got to look at who's saying it, and if I believe it, what's going to happen? Now, the Europeans said this because they had all the what? The money. You see? So when they convinced our people to believe in free markets and open markets and reject nationalism, we all God's children, we all one, and therefore all markets should be open for investment regardless as to who you invest. The deal is, if they had all the money, they're going to end up owning all the land. They're going to end up owning all of the means of production with your consent, with your moral consent. You see? And then you're going to wonder if God is cursing you, if something is wrong. You have to understand, then you can't just let people lay an idea on you, a universal concept, a universal religion, and a universal this, and then assume that all is well. You got to look at reality. So if it's so damn universal, spread that damn money around. Universal. You believe people should invest wherever they fit? Well, let's first even up the money, and then we can invest cross borders and all over the other place. But no, you insist on holding on to your money. You see, and you believe in what? Private property and all this stuff, and you're going to convince me not to look racially or nationally, and this allows you then to what? Maintain control. And this is the game that we're in. So people say, well, Elijah, you know, you're a black Muslim. We don't believe in blackness. No, ladies and gentlemen. Jesus said, what? Man is not made for the Sabbath, but the Sabbath for whom? For man. Ultimately, religion is not made just to be served by man, but what? The religion must what? Serve man. God is not only to be served, but God also must serve the people. Oh yeah, I know, you think you then told you should lay all on your face and roll and carry on. No way. No way. There is a what? Contract. There is a covenant. It's in your Bible. The Israelites had a what? Covenant between God and themselves. There was an agreement there that what? I do for you and what? You do for me, man. It's not just about laying down praying and do whatever you want to the Lord. And if you read Moses, and if you read it, you will see going on between Moses and God, constant what? Negotiation. In fact, that's what I find so fascinating about reading the Exodus story. Hey, this man sits down and negotiates. You remember that time they get near the border and they start hollering and screaming, talking about they were better off than slavery, and they wanted to go back to Egypt, and they were about to hang Moses. They were within an inch of hanging Moses. You know, Moses nearly got hung several times. You know, a lot of people don't read this thing very well at all. He was not seen as some holy man with a halo above it. Those people didn't see Moses that way at all. They got at him. They got so out of hand until God said, let me just strike these people with a thunderbolt and wipe them from the face of the earth. Yeah. And then Moses started doing what? Negotiating with them. And even reminded God, what? Hey, wait a minute now. Remember, you brought them out here on the promise, right? Yeah. And you said that you had a what? Promised land for them, and so forth, and this for them. How are you going to look if all of a sudden you get out here and destroy these people and go, in a sense, against your word? Oh, yeah, you're right, Moses. Yeah, I did say that. Read it. You don't have to believe me as your preacher tell you. Read the Bible. It's right there. Because a negotiation there. What? There's a service between the two things, not just one-way street. And so in black Muslims, in the black nation of Islam, Islam is used also to do what? Serve black folk. You must understand that. As soon as you remove the blackness from it, and blackness has no relevance to it, it loses its capacity to serve our interests. And more often than not, it will serve the interests of Arabs and serve the interests of other people, because it will not change the pre-existing social economic power relationship. You see, and you have to understand that. Elijah understood it very well. You see, so no, we're going to make it black because we wanted to what? Serve black. A racial identity, an ethnic identity, is not a mere way of identifying yourself by a word or a label. It is not a mere designation of ethnic characteristics, nor just a designation of people who may look alike to some degree, or share a similar area, or share a particular area. Ultimately, an ethnic identity is a prescription for behaving, for relating to each other in a particular way, for seeing yourself and seeing each other and seeing the world and relating to God and relating to nature and relating to everything else in the world so that it operates in the interest of the group. Must understand that. In the racial designation or identity is a prescription for action, is a prescription for relating. And in the nation of Islam, when it was black Islam, it means blacks who were Muslims would relate to other blacks in a particular sort of way so that it would benefit blacks who were Muslims. And that's the result of it. Changing their taste, changing the diet, changing the values, and so forth. And what do you mean there then? since the taste changed, the money that flowed out of the Nation of Islam, pursuing the taste created by other people, did what? Flowed back in. Flowed back in. And it means then that money created what we call an accumulation of capital within the nation. It created in many ways a savings on the part of the people, because the $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 that they would spend buying junk and garbage and other kind of crap now was saved, and that saving now could be used to be invested in businesses, to be invested in schools, could be invested in education and the other kinds of things they needed to do for themselves. And that accumulation of wealth was also an investment in power in a society where wealth and power are often correlated. Am I getting through? I know you're getting a little restless. I'm going to let you go in a minute. Let you go in a minute. You see, we have to understand what went on here. I create your taste for beans. I create your taste for this. And because I do, I'm going to make the pie for you, right? We make the pie what? For ourselves. So now you eat the pie, but now, and you spend the money, and that goes back, and we can buy what? Farms. And now we can do what? Grow the beans. You see, we can create the what? Canneries. We can now build a what? A whole system of production based on the reorganization of taste and the reorganization of interests. You see, this is what African-centered education is about, ladies and gentlemen. It's not merely about the teaching of African culture or of African history. That's only a part of it. It is about the transformation of the personality, the transformation of social relations among African people. Ultimately, it is about economic and political development. Ultimately, it is about power. Ultimately, it is about freeing the black mind to move in the world, to be powerful in the world, you see, to produce for self, and to enhance African wealth, and to enhance the African status in the world. This is what it's about, and it's deeper even than this. But let's keep this in mind, and I'll bring it to a close here. When you're talking about black culture in America, when you even talk about African culture in Africa, you must recognize and you must ask yourself, what is the political economy of the oppressed black culture? In other words, remember, our personality is a political, economic structure. Particularly, and therefore, if we let another people shape our personalities and shape our cultures, those cultures and personalities will operate to maintain their system and their dominance. So while we may praise black culture in America and African culture in Africa and in the diaspora, we must also ask ourselves the question, what is the political economy of these cultures, and what are the various personal and social identities these cultures produce, and to whose end? We must recognize that the basic identities of the oppressed are largely socially manufactured by their oppressors' culture and related social practices. And to a good extent, what we call black culture in America today, even though it has deep African roots and African history still buried in it, is still related to and incarnations of Europe-centric culture. And we've got to recognize this and deal with it. We just can't praise it unabashedly.
In order for us to be in the state that we are in today as people, we have to be out of our minds. We literally have to be crazy. It is necessary for us to be crazy. It is necessary for us to be backwards. It is necessary for us to be maladjusted. It is necessary for us to be disunited. It is necessary for us to be self-hating. It is necessary for us to be filled with an inferiority complex. In a world where the European is essentially about 10% of the world's population, if that 10% is to continue to rule over the other 90%, it must keep that 90% out of its mind. It must keep that 90% in a state of deception. It must keep that 90% filled with a feeling of powerlessness and incompetence. If this 10% is to continue to consume more than 60% of the world's resources, if this 10% is to continue to rob African, Asian, and other nations of their material wealth, then it must keep those people in a state of maladjustment. And this implies then that no matter how much integration you may bring about, the feeling of inferiority must be a constant in the black personality. No matter how many people you run for president, no matter how many mayors you get elected, no matter how many people you get on the board of IBM and the others, the basic sense of inferiority, the basic sense of dependency must remain a constant in the black mind. And I will indicate this, and I think this study, which occurred now some 40 years later, shows this to be the case. Dr. Clark shows surprise that after all of this time, this feeling is still there. I would not, and I don't think any student who's basically looked at the necessity of black people being out of their minds as being the foundation of European dominance would not be surprised. I think it was quite predictable. Remember, these children have this feeling of inferiority basically from the end of their second years. You can pick up this sense of inferiority as early as 3.5 years old. So it starts very early. And I'm still working through my mind the implications of that finding. We are talking about preschool children, not only children that are in school, but children who are having this feeling prior to school. This would, of course, indicate that, to a degree, that our environment is saturated with racism through TV, through the various media, through the pictures our walls, through the unconscious and conscious state, and influence the child's behavior and attitude starting in the womb itself. And I often start my developmental classes not with the prenatal period and how egg meets sperm, but with why do you have children in the first place? Because the reasons you have children will influence their development. It will influence them from the time they're in your womb until, of course, the day they die upon this earth. It would indicate then that to a degree and in some way the black community itself has been induced in helping to bring about a feeling of inferiority in its children. To a good extent, it is not so much the actions of racism that destroy us. The discrimination by white folk and Europeans, the kind of hatred that they express toward us as people that destroys us and gives us an inferiority complex. It is to a good degree how we as people react to these actions. Whether we believe the propaganda or not, whether we believe what the European actually has said. We cannot often control the behavior of other people, but we do have a greater control over how we react to that behavior. And to a good extent, the challenge of an Afrocentric education is to educate us in our tendencies to react. To a good extent, it would mean that the actions of racism apparently have induced some of us to accept racist propaganda and to really believe it, to internalize it. Once we internalize the propaganda, then we become social agents for the racists themselves. And to a good extent, then, the black family, once it internalizes the propaganda of Eurocentric racists, becomes a social agent for the racists and begins to produce the kinds of children that the racists want from the time of conception onward. It becomes instructive, you see, to look at a family not as something that just raises children, but a family to a good extent is the social agent of the society. It produces the kinds of children that the society says it needs and wants. The family looks out at the opportunity structure, at its own social position. It looks out at what it views as the future for its children, for its group, for its nation, and it inculcates those views into its children and rears its children in terms of those views, sometimes consciously and sometimes unconsciously. And in that way, it begins to create the children for the society. In a heavily segregated society, for instance, if your black boy or girl would have said some years ago that they wanted to be president of the United States or that they were going to be president of the United States, how many of us, by being realistic, would have discouraged that view? You know, ain't no black man going to be this or no black woman going to be that. Be real. And in the service of being real, by saying, well, I don't want him to be disappointed. I want to save him from racism and save him from the recognition one day that there are limitations to his aspirations. We quietly steer them toward a trade or a skill. Get this and get a job. So what's happening there? While it may have a realistic basis in a certain sort of way, you are also at the same time, though, creating the child's aspirations. You're also creating the child's motivations. You're creating the child's view of itself in line with the way the society is structured. A true Afrocentric family not only relates to its children in terms of reality, but it relates to its children in terms of idealism. It relates in the sense that there is a world that it as an African family and we as an African people want to bring about. While the black man may not be president of the United States, it does not mean that he cannot rule the world. The true Afrocentric family then not only raises its children in terms of the so-called social realities, because it recognizes that social realities are things that men create themselves. And therefore it raises children to create a reality suitable to the advancement and development of black people. But an unconscious black family, an unconscious people, a people who fallen victim to racism, a people who fallen victim to a sense of inferiority, then will produce the kind of inferior children that the white society needs to continue its dominance in the world. And in this way, then, the black family and the black community and black leadership becomes allied with the dominant group and with the Eurocentric group. It is this kind of thing that we must come to become conscious of and to defeat consciously. I'm going to give you a little taste of what I'm writing about in my current book. I want to indicate that black maladjustment is not just a suffering in the soul of black people. It's not just a feeling of inferiority in which over which the individual has to get. It's not just a feeling of alienation that you get over by going to a therapist, that you get over by attending various therapeutic sessions. Black maladjustment is functionally necessary for the world as it is currently constituted. Black maladjustment is a political factor, and I often try to get across to people the understanding that when we go to these universities and these schools, one of the greatest deceptions that's run upon us is the idea that the things that we are taught in these schools are non-political, that they are neutral, that they are somehow universal. And of course, the whites run a beautiful game on us when they, for instance, name their courses without putting their ethnicity in front of them. They don't say white psychology, white education, white economics, white physics, white chemistry, you know. And we often naively then assume, because they're called economics, psychology, anthropology, that means we are in a course that has general and universal meanings. And we are made to think that we are odd when we call a course Black Studies, that there's something wrong with it. But every course in the American college and university and in the American educational establishment is a course in white studies, ladies and gentlemen. And every course in every discipline is designed for essentially the same thing, to maintain white dominance. We must be very conscious of that, and we must recognize that a major part of the education of our children and of ourselves is the fact that we have to politicize the courses that we're taking, even science, even physics and chemistry. So a lot of people think, well, you know, we're talking about atoms and molecules and this and that, and they have no ethnicity and they have no politics. In a fundamental way, you may be right, but on another level, there's a problem with that. Scientific thinking and technological development does not just develop in the head of some genius. It's not the result of some scientific genius who happened to strike upon some major discovery. Scientific discovery and technological development take place within a political social structure. You have to have a political system, a system of social relations, an economic system in order that science and technology develop and flourish. They do not flourish in a vacuum. Therefore, it is not enough just to teach your children physics and chemistry. You must teach them the politics of physics and chemistry. You must teach them the economics of physics and chemistry. You must teach them how a system must organize itself politically and socially such that physical and chemical research take place. It is not enough for us to educate African boys and girls in science and technology so that African can catch up with the Europeans. You will never catch up with the European just by knowing science and technology. Because, ladies and gentlemen, you have to finance technological research. You have to pay scientists to do research. People just don't do research for nothing. If you run the latest physics experiment, you would have to produce a cyclotron with a circumference of some 20 or 30 miles around that costs billions of dollars. And if you're then talking about catching up with the European scientifically, then you must catch up with the European and surpass him, what? Economically. If your children are to work for you and give their scientific genius to the advancement of black people, then we as black people must give them an economic, social, and political foundation in which their gifts can be realized and handed over to us as a people. And therefore, merely to teach chemistry and physics as some neutral subject, as some body of knowledge unrelated to everything else going on into the world, is to be miseducated. That is one of the reasons why we have a country filled, as black people, with chemists, with engineers, machinists, and yet we don't seem to be able to export one gun to South Africa. We don't seem to be able to make one bomb. We have generals and sergeants and Green Berets and Rangers and all of the rest, and yet we are unable to train one guerrilla or anything else to fight for their liberation in this world because there's a lack of social organization. It is not enough just to have knowledge. It is not enough just to have money. Money and knowledge must be organized in order to be effective. And knowledge, in order to flourish and be actualized in some concrete advancement for people, must be based ultimately on social relations between those people. So there must be a social structure. And while your children are learning science and mathematics, they must learn to love themselves and to love one another, and to cooperate one with the other. Or else they'll have an Afrocentric mind, but they will still have to go down to IBM and Xerox and do their work. And ultimately then, they will still be racked by a sense of inferiority and dependency. So we must keep that in mind. Let me quickly state here then that the sense of inferiority in black people and the other problems we talk about will not be removed by assimilation. They will not be removed by integration. They will not be removed by Jesse Jackson being elected president of the United States. They will not be removed by the election of other black politicians. And that doesn't say that Jesse Jackson shouldn't be elected, and it doesn't say that other politicians should not